one of us here with boldness to go out and pray. Lord, be good with you. We pray you and you alone. Jesus' name we pray and all this. Amen.
Well, when Brad gives me an assignment, I take it literally. So that's, if he wants me to do a presentation on being a watchman, and then I found out I was going to be doing two different presentations. And usually my presentations are about a half an hour long, and he says, no, he wants about an hour, which really stretched me. And so, I had to divide being a watchman into two parts. And so this first part basically is, reflecting on what is a watchman? What does it take to be a good watchman? Of course, you can't just have anybody get up there and have the credibility and everything that it would take to be a watchman. So I decided to go with character traits of a watchman. And my husband, when he and I were dating, he had been a Boy Scout, and he gave me the 12 different merits of a Boy Scout. And I thought, whoa, so he still remembered him to this day. So I used that. And then I got some input from a friend in regards to some of the other characteristics. So, and there's several different places in the Bible where it talks about a watchman. Psalms 127:1 says, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. And I thought, yeah, and except we have God indwelling in us, we can't be good watchmen. We have to be able to be equipped and identify the enemy. We have to be able to understand the enemy. And so we need God giving us discernment to do our job. We need to be trustworthy. That's one of the things that Boy Scouts learn. Daniel 1:8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's dainties, nor with the wine which he drank. And Daniel was a watchman. He was trustworthy both to God, and then leading the other people that had had everything taken from them, their culture, their home, their families, and they had been put in as servants, and yet he was faithful to 3 kings and earned their trust and their respect. And that's trustworthy. So I think he's the perfect example of what a good watchman would need to be. And a good watchman needs to be brave. Deuteronomy 31:6 says, be strong and of good courage, fear not, nor be frightened at them. For Jehovah thy God, he it is that goes with thee. He will not fail thee nor forsake thee. And here's David. He was brave even as a child when he took on a lion and a lamb before he ever encountered Goliath. What an example for us to follow. And that's something that I think a lot of us have a hard time working up to. I've met a lot of people that have a doubt of what they're going to do under persecution. There's no reason you should have a doubt. When I think about Stephen and how he did not, I'm convinced Stephen never felt a stone because his eyes were focused on Jesus Christ, sitting at the right hand of the Father. And if we have that kind of mentality, we can be brave in any circumstance. Be kind. And I think of John the Apostle. He used to be a son of thunder, right? But he wrote more about love and kindness than any other apostle that I could think of. In 1 John 3:18, he says, my little children, let us not love in word, neither with the tongue, but in deed and truth. Love makes us approachable so that we can have relationships with other people. They can respect us and honor us as watchmen if we love them. Thrifty, well, who better as an example of being thrifty but John the Baptist? John the Baptist, because he clothed himself in camel hair and loined himself with a leather girdle and ate locusts and wild honey. And right now there's some people that think we should be eating locusts again, or crickets, or ants. I mean, they're trying to get us to do that. So I think we need to be prepared to be thrifty. I think we should be practicing being thrifty right now in regards to the fact that we don't know what's ahead for our economy. That doesn't look good. We don't know what's ahead. I mean, knowing that right now, if they wanted to shut off my finances, my funds at the bank, they could do that. And if I become politically incorrect and the right people are in wrong leader people are in leadership, then we will learn to do with less. And we need to be willing and able and think ahead about what we're going to do. I think about the people in Israel right now have been told, be prepared to stay in your bunker much longer than maybe you've ever done before. And so is that going to affect America? It's possible. I just think that we need to be able to be thrifty and be able to be a resource for others. Be reverent. When I thought about reverence, I thought about Nehemiah 1:4. And it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned certain days. And I fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And I said, oh, I beseech you, O Jehovah, the God of heaven, the great and terrible God that keeps covenant and loving kindness with them that love him and keep his commandments. What a great thing that we can have a relationship with a loving God. We need to revere him because of his greatness and his power. But our enemies don't know a loving God. They don't have a relationship with their God. And we have the privilege of having that. And we need to be reverent like Nehemiah, who was well respected. He was reverent to his king when he got permission to go and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And, all the people looked to him for leadership. He was a watchman over them. He taught them that they needed to keep a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other. So he was reverent, and yet he was a strong leader. He was courageous. Be loyal. When I thought about loyalty, I thought about the loyalty of Jonathan to David. Jonathan was in line to be the next king, and yet he loved David and recognized him as being the person that was going to take the king position, and he stayed loyal to him. So finally, be like-minded, compassionate, loving as brethren, tender-hearted, humble-minded. 1 Peter 3:8. And be obedient. I can't think of anyone that set a better example for us in obedience than Jesus Christ, who was able to lay down everything for us. Not only did he lay down his life for us, but he took our sins upon himself and sacrificed. And I can't imagine the volume of all the sins that came upon him when he was sacrificing on the cross and the agony that he went through. And he said in John 14:21, he that has my commandments and keeps them, he it is that loves me. And he that loves me shall be loved by my Father. And I will love him and will manifest myself to him. Be vigilant. And I think vigilance has already come up before. 1 Peter 5:8, be sober, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walks about seeking whom he may devour. And for that, when I was in the legislature and I dealt with some pretty dicey things and some pretty strenuous times, every morning I would lay there and I would consciously put on the full armor of God, the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth, the sword of the Spirit of God, the word, the shield of faith, and my feet shod with the preparation of the gospel. That's the way we should be as watchmen. We should be putting on our armor and being prepared to go to war. We are at war right now. It's sad to see that most people in America don't realize it. Right now, it's an information warfare. It's a strategic warfare politically, but it's a warfare nonetheless, and it's only going to escalate. Be discerning. Well, Solomon was a good example of someone who asked for discernment, and God, really rewarded him for that. 1 Kings 3:9, Solomon said, give thy servant therefore an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this thy great people? And for us to be discerning in a time of so much deception, in a time where it's hard to know what the truth is because we get so much information coming that is in conflict with one another. I think about when we went through the plague or the uh, pandemic. The reality that the messages coming were confusing to everyone. It created fear and in a lot of people. And for those of us who didn't have fear, and it we we frightened other people. I can remember Renee here and she and I were getting ready to get into an elevator at the Capitol, and two grown men, one of them really good size, were in there with a mask on, and we didn't have a mask on, and the big guy took off running away. I have to get away from you. You don't have a mask on, and it was just shocking. I've never had anyone be so afraid of me before, um, but this is, I mean, the contention that they are trying to, and the confusion that they're trying to create is something that we need to ask for discernment, that we stand on the right side, and that we're faithful, even under a lot of peer pressure to conform. Stay calm. Well, I think, and I thought about this and thought, wow, okay, who's a good example of that? I thought about Job and how long he suffered with everything that he went through. And his wife wasn't exactly encouraging him, telling him to curse God and die, nor were his friends very encouraging to him. But Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths. And Job suffered, but then he was rewarded greatly for his faithfulness. Another one, be prepared to sacrifice. On that, I thought about Paul in Acts 14:19. But there came Jews from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. Here he was, laying there, probably very, very wounded. His friends gathered around him, and he rose up and walked not away, but back into the city. He was prepared to be sacrificed. And I think that when we do endure hardships, when we do face persecution, if we keep our eyes on Christ, we become stronger and more resilient every single time the pressure is brought to bear. And that's something that we need to understand. I think sometimes when I think back at some of the things that I've gone through in my life, I'm going, persecution or trials create character. And I think God is really making a real character out of me. And be patient. When I think about patience, I think about three women in the Bible. I think about Elizabeth, I think about Hannah, and I think about Sarah. Then God rewarded them, and after waiting years and years for a child. Isaiah 40:31, one of my favorite verses. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And then the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. John 1:5. When I started training for counterterrorism, it was a stressful experience, and I lost like 7 pounds in 2 weeks because I lost my appetite. But some of the people that I trained with, I talked to on the phone every once in a while, and one of them told me the dark is going to get darker. It's getting darker. It's increasing. The satanic influence on our world is increasing, but the light is going to shine brighter, and that's what we need to remember. As we see the darkness, remember that we are the light, and let our light so shine before men that they may glorify our Father who is in heaven. So be aware of the move to deceive. Satanic activity is increasing all over the United States, and I think it's been in hiding a lot of. I've heard about it for many years, but now it's blatant, and so we need to be aware of the deception, and the deception that's affecting our children. I bet I can't find one person here that doesn't know a young person who's been deceived into being confused about maybe their gender identity or what's right or wrong with homosexuality. I mean, they are so indoctrinated. So Revelation 12:12 says, "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows he has a short time." And I firmly believe that that's where we are right now. He knows his time is short, and he has escalated his efforts. 1 Timothy 4:1 says, "But the Spirit saith expressly, that in latter times some shall fall away from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits." It's hard to imagine, but it's true. When people, I think about the seeds that are, the story of the seeds being sown on the different types of soil and the rocks, and how some of them take a little bit of the scripture, and they some of them avoid it completely, some of them take a little bit, and they take an interest, and then they get dissuaded by other things, and then some of them, things choke them and they turn around instead of getting more dependent on God. And the seeds that fall on the good soil produce much fruit. But we're seeing that people that we would have thought had faith can really disappoint us greatly by compromising their faith and their stance in order to accommodate maybe the government, maybe just the pressure from the other ecumenical movements. Mark 13:22 says, "For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show signs and wonders, that they may lead astray, if possible, the very elect." So this is something that this is scripture. I believe it. This is something that we need to be aware of. That if we are wavering in any way, we become vulnerable. Satanic clubs in schools. Well, this represents a school in California, and these are just the adult volunteers that are working with the kids to influence them for Satan, educating with Satan. Isn't that a neat? And so that, of course, that's in California. So I mean, everything goes in California, right? Right, Brad? But Satanic After School Club in Olathe, Kansas. How do you explain that? And I know they attempted one in Pittsburgh as well. And so this is here, and it's been being accepted. And I know that one of our stores, I guess they're not doing it any longer, but they actually had a satanic clothing for children section. And I guess the peer pressure is they pulled that off, and they had this picture, up there in the children's section. So this is coming, and I'm sure most of you know that this year we actually had an attempt for a satanic mass at our own state capitol. And I was there that day. There were some individuals that very blatant. They all looked, you could identify them pretty easily by the way they dressed and by the way they behaved. And one of them said, "These people believe that Jesus is the only way to heaven." And I said, "Amen, sister," which didn't go over very well, but but they're out there, and they want to be in our faces now, where they used to be in hiding. So is Harry Potter harmless? I think that whenever you think about the fact that our kids, this was big in schools even, the books, encouraging the kids to read them and everything. I never read any of it. I never saw the movie, but I think when you convince children that there's good witches and there's good witchcraft and there's bad witchcraft, that is a lie straight from the pit of hell. There is God and there is Satan, and Satan is involved in witchcraft. God is not. And he's not a deceiver. And Satan is a great deceiver and a great liar. So Galatians 5:16 says, "Thus I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lusts of the flesh." And I think, Bill kind of talked about that a little bit. I'm going to get into it a little bit more. 1 John 2:16, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world." And what could keep us from being a good watchman? What could destroy our influence for being a good watchman? It would be falling into the lust of the flesh. So I looked at men and just thought I'd be kind of hard on you guys. That's easier. So for men, I mean, it's so easy to get get idols in your life that you're not even aware that you have done that. You start with just drinking a little bit to relax, and then the next thing you know, you can become an alcoholic. And I have experience with that in my own family. And then gambling, another addiction. But it could be just getting home from work and just turning on the TV and just zoning out and not even being aware of the influence of what you're watching. My husband likes to fall asleep with the television on, and last night it was Colbert. That just really turns my stomach. So, and then the lust of the eyes. Men are very visual creatures, and so pornography is so easy to get hooked on and so hard to get away from. From what I've heard, once you see it, I don't know, then you get an abundance of opportunities. They keep on trying to hit you with it to pull you in for an addiction, something that can destroy your testimony and your life. I have a nephew that committed suicide because of it. The pride of life, flashy cars, big money jingling in your pockets. That's so easy to lure people into just, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. But women, I couldn't have gone without getting to us too. The lust of the flesh, dieting, spending more money than necessary on clothes and makeup. Just thinking that we need to fit this model of these airbrushed people that we see on television or in the magazines. The lust of the eyes, the daytime drama shows, the soap operas, the love novels where you start reading those and then you become jealous and upset thinking that you've been deprived of being wealthy and having nice things. I think of 2 Timothy 3:6, which has already been mentioned today. For those are they that creep into houses and take silly women, laden with sins, captive away, led by diverse lusts. So we can easily become victimized by the lust of the eyes. The pride of life, of course, just trying to impress. And I think women usually try to impress other women. I know I do because my husband doesn't have a sense of smell, but I still want somebody to tell me I smell good every once in a while. So I think Phil Robertson, who just died just recently, I just had to honor him in this. The more makeup a woman wears, the more she's trying to hide. Makeup can hide a lot of evil. And then this has already kind of been kind of talked about too. I mean, the fact that the deception that has happened in our country and the different influences that they are trying to get us to conform and accept being woke, which I think it's better to be awake than to be woke. And so, you know, we should not let that affect us. And I know sometimes it's hard to understand how you can be gentle with people that are so deceived and so blatant and prideful about that deception. I like what Andy Griffith said when Opie said, "Paul, what does politically correct mean?" And Andy says, "Well, son, it means giving up your own opinions and beliefs in order to please some whiny little crybabies." So we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places, Ephesians 6:12. So we have to know the devil doesn't come at you through your front door. He looks for cracks in your foundation. So that's another reason for us to put on the full armor of God. That's another reason for us to keep a close relationship with God. If we are not seeking him every day, we are drifting away. There's just no stagnant place to be. You're either growing in him or you are losing ground. So we need to seek wisdom. Proverbs 19:8. He that getteth wisdom loveth his own soul. He that keepeth understanding shall find good. And James 1:5. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, He giveth liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given to him. And I remember I had a grandfather that I had so much respect for, and he had committed all this beautiful poetry to memory. He was a Christian, and that was odd for my family and he was pretty well rejected by my family. But I mean, I asked him, I said, "You have a lot of wisdom. Am I going to inherit that?" And he went, "No, that's something you got to seek for yourself." So this is kind of the way I feel, and I think Wayne can kind of relate to me. We need to be brave, and I love like the Patriots. I love that movie. The fact that we don't give up, we don't turn our back on the enemy, we don't run, and we don't hide. And it's interesting when we stand face to face with the enemy, and they are used to people being afraid of them, and they fear us because we have confidence. The government, I can offer you security, I only require that you kneel, and that's going to be a problem for us. So we need to understand that God did not appoint us and give us a spirit of fear. Diversity, equity, and inclusion have morphed into perversity, insanity, and delusion. I thought that was a pretty good quote. And this is kind of something that I found responding to social justice rhetoric and all of the accusations they come at us with. And I've been called a lot of names by them. And of course, the critical race theory, diversity, we don't have to go very far to see all of these being pushed here in Emporia and probably across the state. Equity doesn't mean equality. It means they want reparations for everything that's been done in the past. And when we think about, it's kind of ironic that they're always bringing up um, like slavery from the past. And right now in Africa, white farmers are being slaughtered. And my brother-in-law, who lives in western Kansas, is hiring Africans to come and work on his farm. Isn't that interesting? you know, it's and slavery has always existed. In Islam, it's still legal to have slaves, and there have been cases in America. Well, there was one down in Tarrant County, Texas, where this couple purchased a young girl as a slave, and police brought her back and enslaved her for 16 years before she escaped. But I mean, that was legal. So discrimination, all these things, decolonization, they really have all kinds of accusations they use against us. We need to understand that they make up words to appease their cause, but they don't define who we are. We know who we are. We're a child of the King. Yeah. Seek discernment, Proverbs 2:3. Yea, if I cry after discernment and lift up thy voice for understanding. And discernment's been brought up more than once today. But it is very important that we seek God's face with discernment. Philippians 1:9, and this I pray that your love may abound yet more and more in knowledge and all discernment. And Ronald Reagan, this goes back to the 80s, but he saw it, and it's still here. The struggle now going on for the world will never be decided by bombs or rockets, by armies or military might. The real crisis we face today is a spiritual one. At root, it is a test of moral will and faith. So we need to be watchmen. We need to have that moral will to stand up and to have the faith that inspires other people to follow. If we ever forget that we are one nation under God, then we will be a nation gone under. Right now, Israel is facing a trial, and I think about these two minarets and the mosque in the background from Islam. That, as a matter of fact, on my computer here it says, "From the river to the sea, Israel will always be." So, but they, their enemies want to completely eliminate them, and all the stuff that's going on with the Palestinian organizations and everything. That's to eliminate the nation of Israel, to eliminate them as people. But once they get them, then the target is America. So Albert Einstein said the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. So this is a video that I was going to show you. Well, I guess it's going to come up. But the sad part about it is, don't. You're awesome.
It's really funny because I really live over the chance to get into this stuff. One of my heroes is stuff is stuff that we saw all the time. It was just the sort of thing. He was a lawyer. He did it for the he would speak to him in a way he told us how it is the way around like after this we went into like this
So that's Eric Metaxas, and he's written a couple of books that are pretty inspiring. One of them is a small book called Letter to the American Church. And did you show that movie? You showed the movie Letter to the American Church, which basically correlates where our church is right now in comparison to where the church was. And we're talking about some of the similar denominations and everything, where the church was in Germany in the late 1930s. And so this is where we are. And it's pretty tragic when we think about the fact that because I was so confused at how in the world Germans could conform the way they did to the things that Hitler brought on the scene. My husband's 100% German. Germans are good people. I'm 25% German in a lot of things, 25% German. And so it was like, how could they have let that happen? It seemed impossible. It's just like how could Adam and Eve be tempted when they got to walk in the garden with God? But the reality is that's human nature. I mean, we have that sin nature, and we want to go along to get along. And by the time we decide that we're going to stand up and not go along, then it's often too late to change anything about the culture. So I want to talk about a couple watchmen that I know. I met Mark Powell under really unusual circumstances. I had been asked to speak to some legislators in Topeka at their prayer breakfast at 7 o'clock on Thursday morning. And so sure, I agreed. I knew those guys, and I went up there, and since I got invited, I just thought I was just going to let him have it, you know. And so I did. I was a watchman, but I told them that they were supposed to be a watchman. They're Christians, they're leaders in the state of Kansas, they make policy, and they should not be pushing for more legalization, like a legalization of marijuana, or increasing the opportunities to gamble, all the things that can become traps for people. Alcohol, expanding the alcohol use. And I just let them have it. You should be calling sin sin, and you should be doing it from the, you know, from the front of the room, and just standing up for what you believe in. And I knew I probably made him mad, but I really didn't care. you know, I thought I did what I felt was right. And so I walked off, and I thought, well, they're not going to invite me back again. But I didn't go to be invited back again. I went to be faithful. And they knew I was a fighter before they invited me, so they should have known better. But then I get this call from this guy, Mark Powell, and he said, I want you to come to my church in Dodge City, and I want you to tell them what you told the legislators. And I want you to do it on Wednesday at a luncheon. And I said, oh, okay. So Dodge City's quite a ways away. I get up at 5:30 in the morning, and I drive to his church, expecting it's probably a ministerial alliance. There's probably going to be 9 to 11 people in Dodge City. But when I get there, I didn't know if they had announced it over the radio, and there were 80 people in the audience. And that was no big deal. I got up and I did exactly what I did with the legislators. I said, if you're in the church and you are a leader in the church, you are supposed to be a watchman over the flock. You're supposed to be calling out sin. And same thing. And I could tell that some people were very angry. So when I sat down and had lunch with him afterwards, he said, I have a problem with homosexuality in my church. And I said, that is a problem. And so after lunch, I just drove back home, and I get this call from him about a week and a half later, and he had gotten behind the pulpit. And I just want you to be able to hear his voice and know that this is a guy that is not pounding on the pulpit, not a fire-breathing guy, not, flashing accusations or pointing at people. And you got to talk to him on the phone. So he's a soft-spoken kind of guy, but he preached right out of Romans 1. And then he said homosexuality is a sin against God. It's not what God intended for us. And some people came up, they grabbed his phone because he was actually broadcasting on Facebook. And so he sent me what he had recorded. And anyway, they grabbed that, and then they went to Nola Folsom, who's an attorney in Wichita, and had a letter drafted up that said that if he had the nerve to go back into his church, that he would be charged with trespassing. And so we had several phone conversations. He said, I just want to get back in. I just want to be able to preach the Easter service. I want to talk about Christ dying for their sins, and offering forgiveness and everything. But he was never allowed to do that. And so I went to the Christ the King Lutheran Church, Dodge City, Kansas. I Googled it and copied a picture of the church. It's a nice church on the inside. It's a nice big church. And I count about 8 people there, maybe, maximum now. But he was actually interviewed by Eric Metaxas. And Eric Metaxas, when he was interviewing him, and Mark told the story, Eric said there should never be a man standing behind the pulpit in that church again. And so anyway, I keep on bringing up Eric Metaxas. But it's not that I follow him regularly, but it's just that these things really tie together. It's just really sad. And I'll say a little bit more about Mark later, and so you'll have to wait for the rest of the story. And this is a video which I don't think I can play because I actually recorded it on online and I couldn't get it copied out. But Congressman Stephen King, back in 2020, talked about another watchman. Mark Powell was a watchman. He was faithful, and he stood up and he called sin sin, and he paid consequences, but he did not regret it. It did not slow him down. Congressman Stephen King here is talking about Phil Haney, who was a friend of mine. Um, we we trained for the 2 weeks on counterterrorism together, and I was trying to avoid him the whole time because I had, after I first saw him, I had this feeling that he was going to get killed, and I didn't know why. It was pretty crazy, so I just kind of kept away from him. But anyway, Stephen King was talking about him. He started out, and he was an entomologist. He was a bug guy. He studied bugs, and he was a Christian. He was a pastor. He, loved youth and loved to play a guitar and sing and praise songs. He was a great guy, but working for the Department of Agriculture on a federal level, and he could, study the diseases and all this kind of stuff caused by bugs and trees and that. So whenever 2001 happened, then the Department of Agriculture got folded into Homeland Security, and he became Homeland Security, and his job was to study the Islamic culture, and he actually taught himself Arabic, and he's very fluent in it. And then he was put in airports when people would be coming in, like Boston, New York, and he would be interviewing these guys that they had suspicions on. And he learned how to figure out, if they were associated with radical Islam. And he started this, and it actually started the Thin Blue Line, which is a law enforcement website where law enforcement could go in if they saw something suspicious when they pulled somebody over. They'd be able to go to the Thin Blue Line, and they would be able to kind of put in what they had, and they could find out if there were other places, or if this particular guy that they pulled over had been stopped in other places. And so he wanted to be a resource for law enforcement. And he got accolades. He was under George W. Bush, and he got all kinds of accolades and awards for the work that he did, and was really doing a great job. And then when Barack Hussein Obama got elected, and Bill was typing the people into particular terror cells. Tablighi Jabhat was his favorite one, I think, but El Shabaab and Al Qaeda, he had all of them, and he would figure out which ones these guys were associated with. And he swore that if he would have been able to continue, he could have prevented a couple of the big attacks that we had, like the Boston bombing and the one that was at the homosexual bar. He knew those guys so well, he could have identified them when they came in. But Obama said scrub everything off the web, eliminate the Thin Blue Line. And he said, we are not looking for terror cells anymore. We are only looking for lone wolves, which is easier to find. So anyway, and he got demeaned, and so that's kind of when I met him. He was, I thought, wow, they're putting him out to pasture. When he got up, and we all had to do a presentation before we could graduate. And I'd never done a PowerPoint in my life before that. But he stood up there and was talking about how he was very emotional about what he was doing, and thought that he was. But afterwards, then he wrote this book, See Something, Say Nothing. And when I left the training, the day I left the training, he came up to me and he gave me, he gave me, I brought it here, but I must have misplaced it. It's a cord of 3 strands. He said, this represents heaven. Gold for the streets of gold, blue for heaven, and white for purity. Everything will be pure there. And he said, I'm giving this to you because you were chosen. And I said, I don't know what that means. He said, you don't need to understand it. You just need to know that you were chosen. And then he sent me 6 Customs and Border Patrol hats for my grandkids, and I kept one of those. And so I was kind of, that was impressive and a surprise because I'd never had a conversation with him before. And then I saw him places that I never expected to see him. I mean, I'm from Kansas, for Pete's sakes. And I went to a conference down in Missouri, and he was speaking there. There he was. I went to the Republican convention in Cincinnati in 2016, and someone was, and I had this book in my room at the time. See Something, Say Nothing. I was reading it, and I saw someone being interviewed on the floor of the convention, and I walked up to him and I said, "What are you doing with Phil's book?" And he said, "You know Phil?" And I went, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, he's here." And so we got a copy of this book because I knew some people that were working for the Trump campaign into Trump's hands that night. But anyway, and he just sat down and he said, you know you were chosen. I went, every Christian's chosen. I don't know what you're talking about. He said, you don't need to understand it. You just need to know you were chosen. And then he told me that he had a zip drive around his neck that he carried with him everywhere, and that it had enough information on it to bury the Clintons and all of their indiscretions, all of their illegal activity. I know this sounds political. I'm sorry, but this. And he said, so I've gotten myself a RV, and I'm just trying to stay ahead of them because I know I'm marked. And so, anyway, that's what he told me. And Congressman King met him when I went to Washington, D.C. one time to meet this attorney. There, he introduced me to Phil, and I didn't know he knew Phil or anything. But at that time, Phil had been invited by Louis Gohmert to testify in one of their committees. And I think this was under the first Trump administration. And so all of a sudden, Phil went from being in the background to being out, obviously, in the forefront and testifying in front of Congress. And so Congressman Stephen King knew him and considered him to be a friend. Louis Gohmert from Texas considered him to be a good friend. I found out he had friends all over the United States. And then he disappeared for 3 days. He was engaged to be married, and his first wife had died, and he was engaged to be married in a couple months, and he disappeared for 3 days, and they found his body on the side of the road with a gunshot wound in the chest. And initially they said that it was suicide, and which seems kind of interesting. I mean, his body was prone, his gunshot, and inconveniently blew himself. And there was no zip drive around his neck. There was never any evidence found of all of the stuff that he had compiled for the book. And so there's a thought that he was probably tortured for 3 days before they ended his life. So he was commemorated on the House floor of the U.S. House. And so that's a watchman. Bill Haney was a watchman, and he was a Customs and Border Patrol agent. He was a teacher. He loved to teach other people. He was a pastor. He was a counterterrorism expert, and he was a friend. So this was actually taken in Kansas City when I heard that Frank Gaffney and some other guys were going to be speaking at a church up there. So I went, and they ended up inviting me to come up and speak. But there was Phil Haney again. It's one of those times that I'm just like, God appointed him to be my friend, even though I tried to avoid him whenever we went through the training. So we should be watchmen. Do we think that this is going to happen to us? Personally, I don't care. if it happens to me, because I know where I'm going. I'm persuaded that he's able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. So I don't care. Um, I know that God has appointed us all for a mission, and I think He wants us all to be working overtime right now to get the word out. So go back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." And it's sad to say that a lot of pastors are afraid to speak about sin behind the pulpits. They don't want to offend anybody. So that only tells me one thing. They are trying to please man and not God. And they're supposed to be serving God and speaking to man. So study God's word, seek God's face, follow Jesus, be a watchman. 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly divided the word of truth. Thank you. And can we just pray? Heavenly Father, you are an awesome God. And Lord, I thank you for the awesome people that you have put here. I thank you for, I got to say, when Ken was working on my computer, I was thinking, our God is an awesome God. And then when Ken fixed my computer, I said, Ken's an awesome man. So, Lord, I just thank you for all that you've done for us. I praise you, and I pray for the rest of the conference, that you will speak to our hearts, that you will equip us, Lord God, to be watchmen, that you will just help us, Lord, to be effective in touching other people's hearts and giving you all the glory. For it's in Jesus' holy and precious name I pray.